I want to thank you again for being with us. I kind of struggled this week because we're finishing up a 3-week series that we've been looking about some really popular verses that are shared on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or whatever, or hashtagged or looked at on the Bible app or something like that. And this week, we're finishing this series, and I thought, well, how do I tie this in to Mother's Day? And yes, Happy Mother's Day. And then a really good friend of mine posted something on Facebook yesterday, which I found really interesting, and it's the very text that we're going to be talking about today. And she was talking about how her mom, no matter what was going on, always found a way to be satisfied. And so I knew right then that we were probably on the track that God had us on, and we're gonna finish this series out tonight. I'm gonna tell you before we get into the text, I'm convinced the reason why this verse is so popular is because it may be one of, if not the most misunderstood, most misinterpreted, most misapplied verses in all of the Bible. And here's why. When you read this verse that we're going to look at today, and then you kind of just isolate it from everything else, it becomes the ultimate verse in positive thinking. This is the kind of verse that when you hear this verse, you may think, whoo, I really need to get in the gym. Or you might think, I think I could go run a marathon. Or you think, even though you can't sing at all, that you might better try out for American Idol. When you read this kind of verse, that's kind of what you start thinking about. And as a matter of fact, a very well-known preacher once even drew this conclusion about this very verse. He said, most people tend to magnify their limitations. They focus on their shortcomings, but Scripture makes it plain. All things are possible to those who believe. That's right. It's possible to see your dreams fulfilled. He goes on to say it is possible to overcome that obstacle. It is possible to climb to new heights. It is possible to embrace your destiny. You may not even know how it will all take place, and you may not have a plan. But all you have to know is that if God says you can, you can. And I'm sure some of you you've already got figured out what verse we're going to be talking about today. But here, the number one most shared verse, the verse that was looked at, it was shared, it was hashtagged, tweeted, texted, bookmarked more than any other verse in the Bible. And most everybody here today will know it by heart. Philippians 4 in verse 13. I can do all things through him who gives me strength. And I'll tell you, even if you are here today and you may not believe in the Bible, you can understand why that verse would be so popular. Because isolated from anything else, that verse appears to say that nothing's impossible. If you can see it, you can be it. If you can believe it, you can achieve it. Nothing's impossible because you can do anything through Christ who strengthens you. First of all, there's two problems with that. Number one, Paul, who wrote this, did not intend for that verse to be taken the way that so many take it. Paul is not claiming in this verse that if you love Jesus, you can turn into Superman. Or if you love Jesus and your boat is sinking, you can walk on water. That is not what Paul is saying here. Paul was not saying that nothing in this life is impossible, because that's the second problem with this verse. We know that there are some things in this life that are absolutely impossible for us. So a good rule of thumb when you're interpreting the Bible is that you never take a text out of context. Never isolate a text out of context. But here's the good news. Even though this verse doesn't mean what a lot of people have taken it to mean, the beautiful thing about this verse is when you actually put it into context and you see what it really does mean, it still doesn't lose any of its power. In fact, when you see it in context, it actually gains power. The book of Philippians was a letter that Paul wrote to the church in Philippi. And this church actually became one of the most prosperous, one of the most explosive churches in all of the New Testament. They were very generous in their giving to Paul and his missions. And they were generous because they wanted Paul to do what they had done, what he had done for them in other places. And that's kind of what Paul's referring to when you read verse 10 of this text. And then you read these two verses before Philippians 4:13, and it becomes very clear what the actual meaning is. Here's everything that Paul says in this text, starting in verse 11. I'm not saying this because I'm in need, for I've learned to be content in whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need. I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. Paul says, well, let me make sure you understand why I'm writing this to you. I have learned firsthand the secret of satisfaction in any situation. Paul says, don't get the idea that I'm writing to tell you how to get out of a situation, but I'm going to tell you how to be satisfied in that situation. You see, church, Paul had experienced two simple little words that had taught him how to unlock the secrets of satisfaction. And those two words are found in verse 13 that we started with. And those two words are through him. I can do all of this through him who gives me strength. You see, Philippians 4:13 is not and never was about how to be successful. Philippians 4:13 is all about understanding that the only source of real satisfaction you will ever get in this life on this side of heaven is found in Jesus and Jesus alone. Anything else may satisfy for a while, but it will never permanently satisfy. When you understand who Jesus is and what you have in Jesus, then you can be totally satisfied regardless of what your current circumstances may be. John Piper once said, Jesus is most glorified when I am most satisfied in Jesus. Or in other words, we should be totally satisfied when Jesus is glorified in us the most. Take any situation. You know, I spent about 6 hours off and on this week trying to find one situation where this is not true. And maybe you're smarter than I am, but I couldn't find one. Take any situation in life, and let me ask you one question about that situation. Do you believe the way that you're currently conducting yourself in that situation of life is glorifying Jesus? If your answer is yes, then you ought to be totally satisfied. So Paul takes this passage and he teaches us 3 lessons on how to learn the secret to total satisfaction and total contentment. Number 1 is contentment, found in Philippians 4 and verse 11. I'm not saying this because I'm in need, for I've learned to be content whatever the circumstances. Paul says here that contentment is an acquired skill. So if you don't learn how to be totally satisfied with where you are today and what you have today, then you're never going to be satisfied with where you go and what you have tomorrow. There's a 14-year-old boy, his first name is Jason, and I stumbled on this about 2 weeks ago. He wrote probably the wisest words that I've ever read in my life. This 14-year-old boy wrote a poem that is titled Present Tense, and here's what he wrote. It was spring, but it was summer that I wanted. The warm days and the great outdoors. It was summer, but it was fall that I wanted. The color of the leaves and the cool, dry air. It was fall, but it was winter I wanted. The beautiful snow and the joy of the holiday season. It was winter, but it was spring that I wanted. The warmth and the blossoming of nature. I was a child, but it was adulthood that I wanted. The freedom and the respect. I was 20, but it was 30 that I wanted. To be mature and sophisticated. I was middle-aged, but it was 20 that I wanted. The youth and the free spirit. I was retired, but it was middle-aged that I wanted. The presence of mind without limitations. My life was over, but I never got what I wanted. You know, so many people live their entire lives in the desert of dissatisfaction. They're frustrated when they're born, and they're frustrated when they die, and they're always frustrated. And they're always frustrated because they never learn the simple thing of being satisfied right where they are. The reason why we're never satisfied with the next thing is because we're not satisfied with the present thing. Let me say that again. The reason why we are never satisfied with the next thing is because we're not satisfied with the present thing. And if you can't learn to be satisfied today, then I can promise you this. You're not going to be satisfied with tomorrow either. There was a man who had a farm. He became dissatisfied with his farm. He got restless because he wanted a bigger farm. He wanted a better farm. So he called a real estate agent and he said, I want to sell my farm. The agent said, well, I've been by your place and I don't think that's going to be very hard to do at all. He said, let me kind of write up a description about your place and I'll come by in the afternoon and I want to share it with you. So this real estate agent writes the description of the farm. He called him up and he said, hey, I don't want to put this in the paper until I've actually read it to you. So can I come by for a few minutes? And the guy said, sure, come on by. So the real estate agent came in, they sat down, and the real estate agent says, okay, here's what I want to put in the paper about your place. He said, beautiful farm for sale. 250 acres of rolling hills, fertile valleys, quiet streams. The climate is excellent year-round. The land is very, very fertile for any crop. Beautiful two-story house, 3 barns in excellent condition, situated in a fantastic neighborhood. Farmer paused for a minute and he said, could you read that to me again? Real estate agent says, sure. So he reads it to him again. Farmer looks at him and he says, I want to take that off the market now because that's exactly what I've been looking for my entire life. See, church, it's all about learning the lesson of being content with who you are and where you are today. Every day you are where you are. And I know it's hard for some of you to believe today, but you can actually be satisfied where you are today. And what's even more important than that is that's where God wants you to be. Here's the second thing. Paul said, contentment is a life that you can live and not just a lesson that you can learn. Philippians 4 and verse 12. I know what it is to be in need. I know what it is to have plenty. I've learned the secret of being content in every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. And I know, I've been here long enough to know what some of you are thinking right now. You know, that may be real easy for Paul to say, but he's not going through what I'm going through right now. Paul's not experiencing what I'm experiencing. Let me tell you the good news and the bad news of that thought. The good news is you're probably right. You're probably right. Paul probably never was in your situation exactly. But here's the bad news. Even on your worst day, you have never been through anything like Paul went through. You see, Paul spent just about as much time in his adult life in jail as he did out of jail. Paul had a contract put out on his own life. 5 times he was beaten with a whip, and he was given 39 stripes. 3 times he was beaten with rods. Once he was stoned. In church, when I say stoned, I'm talking about rocks being thrown at him, not what some of you might be thinking today. Rocks thrown at you with the intent to kill you. 3 times he was shipwrecked. One of those times he spent a day and a night in the water. He was rejected by the very people that he grew up with, the Jews. He was persecuted by the very people he was trying to reach out to and teach. Most of the time, he was without food. He was without family. He was without finances. He was without friends. He was without fellowship. And he was without something that we covet in our country today, freedom. He was without it. And even with all of that, Paul said, you know, I've learned to be in every single one of those situations to be totally and completely satisfied. So contentment is a lesson that you can learn. It's a life that you can live. And then real quick today, contentment comes from the Lord that you love. Philippians 4, verse 13. I can do all things through him who gives me strength. Paul said, I can be totally satisfied in any situation that I'm put in. I can be totally satisfied in any location that I'm put in because it is Jesus who gives me strength. By the way, the key word in this text is actually strengthen. And in the Greek, it is actually a medical term, and it refers to a blood transfusion. It means to take one thing and transfuse it into something else. And here's what Paul is saying. Paul said, when you become a follower of Jesus, you don't just live for him because he lives life through you. When you read the 4 Gospels, what you find that ought to stand out to you, especially in your struggles of life, is that Jesus lived a life on this earth with total satisfaction, total contentment. See, Jesus never griped. He never complained. He never whined. He never threw a pity party for himself. And you're not going to be totally satisfied in this life until the most important thing in your life is your relationship with Jesus Christ. You will never be satisfied. Nobody, I know y'all, and I know you know me, and I'll tell you this, what I know, nobody that I know loves their wife more than I love my wife. And nobody loves their kids more than I love my kids. I would die for them today. And I tell you that to tell you this. I don't love anybody as much as I love Jesus. Because you see, my satisfaction is not found in my family. My satisfaction is not found in my finances, or as much as I love you, my satisfaction is not even found in this church. My satisfaction is found in Jesus, because Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. See, Jesus never changes. And I can promise you this. I'll promise you this. If you're visiting today and you're looking for a church, I want to promise you this going in. If you will give this church or any other church that is there enough time, we will disappoint you. And if you will give me enough time, I promise you, I will disappoint you. But you know what? Jesus will never disappoint you. Find your satisfaction in Jesus. If you have everything that you could ever want without Jesus, you still don't have anything. But if you have nothing with Jesus, you have everything. Jesus lived a totally satisfied life. And Jesus went to the cross and he died a totally satisfied death. Jesus was raised from the grave as a totally satisfied Lord. And because of that, anything that Jesus commands me to do, I can do. Not I can do everything that I want to do. That is not what this verse says. What this verse says is you can't do everything you want to do, but through Jesus you can do everything that you ought to do, and through Jesus you can do everything he wants you to do. So God says, here's what I want you to do. I want you to be satisfied. I want you to be content. If you have a job or if you don't have a job. If you're popular or you're unpopular. If people like what you preach about or they don't like what you preach about. If people think you are the greatest thing since sliced bread or they would like to slice you up like bread. See, it doesn't matter. Learn to be content, because when all the smoke is cleared and all the Supreme Court decisions have been made and all the culture has shifted one way or the other, Jesus says, you still have me. And I'm still all that you need. You know, some people are so afraid of change. They're so afraid of change that they will never step out in faith and follow the path that God has prepared for them all along. But if we find our contentment in Jesus alone, then you can be totally satisfied wherever you are. So are you living that life today? Are you living a life of satisfaction and contentment? Because you know you have Jesus. If not, he offers you an invitation today to come to him while we stand and sing.